The great chamber of the Galactic Council had stood for over 10,000 years. It sat at the heart of Varith Prime, a world so old that even its mountains had been shaped by the hands of civilization. The chamber was wide enough to hold a small city inside it. Its ceiling was made of living crystal that shifted colors with the mood of the room. On this day, the crystal glowed a calm and lazy blue. Nothing important was expected. 43 species held seats in the council. Some were tall and thin, with skin like polished stone. Others floated in gravity bubbles, their bodies too soft for solid ground. A few were made of light and sound, barely visible to the eye. Together, they controlled trade routes, star systems, and the fates of billions of lives across the galaxy. They had done so for a very long time, and in that long time they had grown very comfortable. High Arbiter Zelkon stood at the center of the chamber. He was Velethi, a species of tall, gray-skinned beings with 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern on their faces. His robes were white and heavy with golden thread. He moved slowly, the way all powerful creatures moved, because he had never needed to hurry. "We have a small matter to discuss before we close the session," Zelkon said. His voice was deep and smooth, and the translation systems carried it to every ear and mind in the room. "A new species has achieved faster-than-light travel in the outer spiral arm. Sector 7G, a small yellow star. The species calls itself human." A murmur went through the chamber. New species reaching FTL was not rare, but it was always worth noting. It meant a decision had to be made. Zelkon waved a hand, and a holographic display appeared in the air above the chamber floor. It showed a blue and green planet, small, covered mostly in water, spinning around an unremarkable star. Data scrolled alongside the image: population, energy output, biological classification, lifespan. Ambassador Dreth of the Dravani Imperium leaned forward in his seat. The Dravani were a reptilian species, broad, scaled, and proud. They had the largest military fleet in the council, and they never let anyone forget it. Dreth studied the data with his slit-pupil eyes and let out a low, rumbling laugh. "This is the species," he said. "They live on a world that is trying to kill them. Their atmosphere is corrosive. Their gravity is heavy. They only live for, what does that say, 80 revolutions. And they are soft. No armor, no claws, no venom." Laughter spread through the chamber. Even species that did not usually agree with the Dravani found this amusing. "They are endurance predators," one of the scientific advisors noted from a lower platform. "They chase their prey until it collapses from exhaustion. They sweat to cool their bodies, which allows them to run for extraordinary distances without overheating." "So they are persistent animals," Dreth said. "Sweaty, stubborn animals playing with engine parts." More laughter. The crystal ceiling flickered with shades of yellow and pink, amusement. Zelkon let the laughter settle. He was not a cruel being, but he was practical. "The question before the council is simple," he said. "Do we integrate them, quarantine them, or bring them under compliance?" Integration meant treating them as equals. Quarantine meant sealing their system and leaving them alone. Compliance meant sending a fleet to deliver an ultimatum: surrender your sovereignty and resources, or face military action. Most new species chose surrender. The ones that did not were made into examples. "I see no reason for integration," said the Kothari delegate, a being made of crystallized energy that pulsed as it spoke. "Their technology is decades behind ours at minimum. They have nothing to offer." "Quarantine is a waste of resources," Dreth added. "Their system has useful minerals. Their planet has water. We should bring them under compliance and be done with it." One by one, the delegates voiced their opinions. The conversation was short. Nobody argued. Nobody raised concerns. Humanity was small, young, and far away. This was routine. Only one delegate did not speak. In the far corner of the chamber, in a seat that was shaped like a nest of dark metal, sat the Illyrathi observer. The Illyrathi were an insectoid species, quiet, patient, and very old. They rarely voted on anything. They preferred to watch. Their observer was a thin creature with a long head, 4 arms folded neatly in its lap, and black eyes that reflected everything and revealed nothing. Zelkan noticed the silence. "Observer," he said, "do you wish to add anything?" The Illyrathi tilted its head. Its voice was soft, like dry leaves scraping across stone. "I have studied this species in some detail," it said. "They come from what our classification system calls a Class 12 death world." The chamber quieted slightly. Class 12 was high, very high. It meant the planet was actively hostile to the life that lived on it. Extreme weather, predators, tectonic instability, radiation. And yet they survived, the Illyrathi continued. They did not merely survive, they conquered their world, every corner of it. They adapted to frozen wastelands, burning deserts, deep oceans, and high mountains. They built structures that touched the sky and machines that split the atom. Dreth waved a clawed hand. "Many species conquer their homeworld. It does not make them a threat." "No," the Illyrathi agreed. "But most species conquer their world together. Humanity conquered theirs while also fighting each other, constantly, for their entire history." It paused. "They have never known peace, not truly, and yet they still reach the stars." The chamber was quiet for a moment. Then the quiet broke and the laughter returned. Dreth shook his massive head. "All the more reason to bring them to heel quickly," he said, "before they point their aggression outward." The vote was called. 42 species voted in favor of compliance. The Illyrathi abstained. "So noted," Zelkan said. "A compliance fleet will be dispatched to the Sol system. Commander Torvan will lead the operation." Commander Torvan was Dravini, a career officer with a spotless record. He had overseen 11 compliance operations. All 11 species had surrendered within hours of his arrival. He was efficient, experienced, and utterly confident. His fleet consisted of 200 warships, cruisers, destroyers, carriers, and his flagship, the Dominance of Will, a vessel so large it had its own internal weather system. The fleet was assembled in orbit above Vareth Prime within 3 days. It was an impressive sight, a river of metal and light stretching across the stars. Before departure, Torvan received his orders in person from Zelkan. The High Arbiter stood on the observation deck of the Dominance of Will and looked out at the fleet with satisfaction. "Deliver the standard ultimatum," Zelkan said. "Give them 1 cycle to respond. If they refuse, disable their orbital infrastructure and blockade the planet. No extinction, we need their labor force." Torvan bowed his heavy head. "It will be done, High Arbiter. I expect to return within 10 days. Zelkan nodded and left the ship. As he walked back through the docking corridor, he passed a small Illyrathi standing near the wall. He almost did not notice it. The creature was still as a shadow. "High Arbiter," the Illyrathi said softly. Zelkan paused. "Yes." "No species survives a death world without learning how to bite." Zelkan stared at the small creature for a long moment. Then he smiled, the thin, polite smile of someone who had already made up his mind. "They are welcome to try," he said. He walked away. The Illyrathi watched him go. Its black eyes reflected the lights of the corridor, and if it had been capable of sighing, it would have. 3 days later, Commander Torvan's fleet entered faster-than-light travel. 200 warships cut through the fabric of space like a blade through silk. Their destination was a small yellow star in the outer spiral arm, a place no one in the Council had ever considered important. They expected to find a frightened primitive species. They expected surrender. They expected to be home within the week. They were wrong about all of it. The edge of the Sol system was dark and cold. Out beyond the last planet, beyond the scattered ice and rock of the Kuiper belt, there was nothing but silence and empty space. It was the kind of place where light from the distant sun was just another dot among millions. It was the kind of place that made even seasoned officers feel small. Commander Torvan stood on the bridge of the dominance of will and watched his fleet drop out of faster-than-light travel. 200 warships emerged one by one, their hulls glowing faintly as they shed the energy of the jump. The formation was perfect. Every ship was exactly where it should be. Torvan allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. This was what discipline looked like. "Full scan of the system," he ordered. "Find their settlements, their stations, their fleet. I want a complete picture before we make contact." His sensor officer, a young Draveni with bright green scales, worked the console for several seconds. Then she stopped. She worked it again. Then she turned to face Torvan with an expression he had never seen on her face before. "Commander," she said, "we have been detected." Torvan blinked. "Explain." 14 separate tracking systems have locked onto our fleet. They are scanning us across multiple frequencies, electromagnetic, gravitational, and at least 3 wavelengths I do not recognize. She paused. "Sir, they knew we were coming. The tracking locks were active before we exited FTL." The bridge went quiet. Torvan felt the first flicker of something unfamiliar in his chest, not fear, but surprise. No species in his experience had ever detected a compliance fleet before it arrived. The FTL signatures were supposed to be invisible to any technology below Tier 4. "How?" he asked. The sensor officer shook her head. "Unknown. They appear to have deep space sensor networks placed throughout the outer system, passive detection arrays hidden inside asteroids and comets. They have been watching the approaches to their system for some time." Torvan straightened his back. This changed nothing. Clever sensor networks did not win wars. Ships and weapons won wars. "Continue the scan," he said. "Find their fleet." Before the scan could complete, the communications console lit up. An incoming transmission, directed specifically at the dominance of will, on the Draveni military command frequency. Torvan stared at the console. That frequency was classified, heavily encrypted. There was no way a primitive species could know it. "Put it through," he said. The voice that filled the bridge was calm, clear, and female. It spoke in perfect galactic common, the shared language of the Council, with no accent, no hesitation, and no fear. "This is Admiral Lydia Okonkwo of the United Earth Navy. I am addressing the commander of the incoming fleet. We detected your approach 47 hours ago and have been monitoring your movements since. Please state your identity and intentions." Torvan took a slow breath. He had done this 11 times before. The words were familiar. "This is Commander Torvan of the Draveni Imperium, acting on behalf of the Galactic Council. Your species has been identified as a newly spacefaring civilization. Under Council Regulation 4412, you are required to submit to a compliance assessment. This includes the transfer of sovereign authority over your system, its resources, and your species' labor capacity to the Council for a period of no less than 500 standard cycles. Failure to comply will result in military enforcement." He delivered the words in his usual tone, firm, practiced, and completely without emotion. He had watched species crumble at these words. He had watched leaders beg. He had watched entire governments collapse into panic. The channel was silent for 6 seconds. Then Admiral Okonkwo spoke again. Her voice had not changed. It was still calm, still professional. But there was something underneath it now, something hard, like iron buried beneath soft earth. "Commander Torvan, we have received and understood your message. Humanity respectfully declines. You and your fleet have 6 standard hours to withdraw from our system. This is not a negotiation." Torvan stared at the communications console. In 11 compliance operations, no species had ever said no. They had begged. They had bargained. They had stalled for time, but none of them had simply, flatly, politely refused. His first officer, a scarred veteran named Calveth, leaned close. "She is bluffing, Commander. They must be." Torvan nodded slowly. "Locate their fleet. Show me what we are dealing with. The sensor officer worked her console for a long moment. When she turned back, her expression was strange, not worried exactly, but confused. Commander, I have completed a full system scan. I can find only one military vessel. One fleet group. No, sir. One vessel. A single ship. It is holding position in open space near the orbit of their fifth planet, the gas giant. Torvald walked to the main display. The holographic map of the Sol system expanded before him. There was Earth, small, blue, turning slowly. There were stations in orbit, satellites, a few mining operations on nearby moons. And there, floating alone in the dark between the fourth and fifth planets, was a single contact. It was large, very large. The sensors estimated it at just over 19 kilometers in length. It was bigger than the dominance of will. It was bigger than anything in Torvald's fleet, but it was still one ship. One ship, Kalvith said, and there was disbelief in his voice. They are facing a compliance fleet of 200 warships with one ship. Torvald studied the reading. The vessel's energy signature was unusual. It was running hot, far hotter than any ship he had seen, and there were readings his sensors could not fully interpret. The power output alone was staggering. It was as if the ship was carrying a small star inside itself. "What is that energy source?" Torvald asked. The sensor officer ran the analysis 3 times before answering. "Sir, it appears to be a contained stellar fragment, a piece of an actual star held in magnetic confinement. It is powering the entire vessel." The bridge crew exchanged glances. Stellar containment was theoretical. The Council's best scientists had discussed it, argued about it, and ultimately dismissed it as impossible with current technology. And these humans, these soft, short-lived creatures from a death world, had done it. Torvald pushed the thought aside. One ship was one ship. It did not matter how big it was or what powered it. Numbers won battles. This was a fact older than space travel itself. "Open a channel," Torvald said. The connection was made. "Admiral Okonkwo," Torvald said, "I admire your courage, but you have one vessel and I have 200. I will give you one final opportunity to reconsider." The response was immediate. "Commander, I appreciate your concern, but I should tell you something about this ship." There was a pause, not for drama, Torvald realized later, but because she was choosing her words carefully. "The Thermopylae was not built to fight your fleet. It was built to make sure we would never have to fight more than once. You are welcome to test that statement, but I would not recommend it." Kalvith snorted. "She names her ship after a battle. What kind of species names warships after battles?" Torvald did not answer. He was looking at the sensor data again. The ship, the Thermopylae, was not moving. It was not powering weapons. It was not raising shields. It simply sat there like a boulder in a river and waited. He thought about the sensor networks that had detected his fleet before arrival. He thought about the classified frequency that the humans had somehow cracked. He thought about the impossible energy source burning inside that enormous hull. And for just a moment, he hesitated. Then training took over. He had his orders. The Council had voted. 200 ships against one was not a battle, it was a certainty. "All ships," Commander Torvald said, his voice carrying across the fleet-wide channel, "advance to combat formation. Weapons hot. Target the human vessel." 200 warships began to move. Their engines flared blue and white against the black of space. They arranged themselves into the standard Draveni assault pattern, a crescent of firepower designed to overwhelm a target from multiple angles at once. Ahead of them, the Thermopylae waited. Its running lights were steady. Its engines hummed at idle. If a ship could look patient, this one did. Admiral Okonkwo's voice came through one final time. It was quiet now, almost gentle, like someone giving a warning they knew would not be heard. "Commander Torvald, for the record, we gave you a chance." The channel closed. The fleet moved forward, and somewhere in the dark, the Thermopylae began to wake up. The first shots came from the Draveni cruiser Iron Tide. Its plasma lances fired in a bright, synchronized burst, 6 beams of superheated energy that crossed the distance in less than a second and struck the Thermopylae along its forward hull. The impact lit up the darkness like a second sun. Then the rest of the fleet opened fire. 200 ships unleashed everything they had: plasma lances, graviton missiles, particle beams, kinetic rounds the size of buildings, accelerated to a fraction of light speed. The combined firepower of the Compliance fleet was enough to crack a continent. It was enough to boil an ocean. It had broken species before. The barrage hit the Thermopylae from every angle. The crescent formation was designed for exactly this, to surround a target in overlapping fields of destruction so that no part of it could escape. The ship disappeared behind a wall of light and heat and force. On the bridge of the Dominance of Will, Commander Torvan watched with his arms folded. The display showed impact after impact. Energy readings spiked. Radiation bloomed. For 10 full seconds, the fleet poured its fury into the space where the human ship had been. "Cease fire," Torvan ordered. "Show me the result." The weapons fell silent, the light faded, the sensors cleared. The Thermopylae was still there. It had not moved. It had not even changed its orientation. It sat in exactly the same position, its massive hull glowing faintly where the plasma had washed over it, but otherwise completely intact. Torvan felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Damage assessment," he said quietly. The sensor officer's voice was unsteady. "No significant damage detected, Commander. The hull appears to be covered in some form of adaptive material. It is shifting. The surface is rearranging itself at the molecular level. It absorbed the energy from our weapons and redistributed it across the entire structure." "That is not possible," Colvith said. "There is more," the sensor officer continued. Her hands were shaking now. "The ship's defensive systems did not just block our weapons. They analyzed them. Every weapon type, every frequency, every energy signature. The ship cataloged everything we fired and has already begun adjusting its defenses to counter each one. Our weapons will be even less effective if we fire again." The bridge was silent. 200 ships had fired everything they had at a single target, and the target had treated it like a learning exercise. Then the Thermopylae moved. It was not a dramatic motion. The great ship simply rotated slowly, almost casually, until its forward section faced the center of the Draveni crescent. Along its hull, panels slid open. Structures extended from within, long, dark shapes that pulsed with a deep blue light. Weapons, dozens of them. And at the very center of the forward hull, something larger began to glow. It was a deep, terrible violet, the color of a bruise, the color of a dying star. "Energy spike from the human vessel," the sensor officer shouted. "Massive energy spike. It is off the scale." The Thermopylae fired. A single beam of violet light erupted from its forward cannon and crossed the distance to the Draveni cruiser Iron Tide in an instant. The beam did not burn through the ship. It did not explode against the hull. Instead, something far worse happened. The Iron Tide collapsed. Its hull crumpled inward as if crushed by an invisible fist. The metal bent and twisted and folded. The ship, all 800 meters of it, compressed into a space no larger than a stone. It happened in less than 2 seconds. There was no explosion, no fire. The ship simply ceased to exist as a ship and became a tiny, dark marble floating in space. A mass inversion cannon. A weapon that reversed the gravitational field inside a target and crushed it with its own weight. The Council had theories about such weapons. They had never built one. They had never believed anyone could. The Thermopylae fired again, and again, and again. 3 more cruisers collapsed in rapid succession, folding in on themselves like paper in a closing hand. The fleet formation shattered as captains broke ranks, desperate to move out of the firing line. But the Thermopylae was not aiming randomly. It was choosing targets with surgical precision, picking off the largest and most dangerous ships first. Then came the swarm. From ports along the length of the Thermopylae's hull, millions of tiny objects launched into space. They were small, no bigger than a fist, and they moved with terrifying speed and coordination. They were drones, each one carrying a micro-singularity charge, a tiny, artificial black hole compressed to the size of a grain of sand, set to detonate on contact. The drones did not fly toward their targets, they phased through them. The fleet's shields were designed to stop energy weapons, physical projectiles, and missiles. They were not designed to stop objects that could shift their molecular phase and pass through solid matter like ghosts through a wall. The drones slipped through shields and hulls alike and detonated inside the ships. The results were catastrophic. A destroyer from the Kothari fleet simply came apart, its midsection vanishing into a brief, swirling point of absolute darkness before the rest of the ship tore itself to pieces. A carrier lost its engine section when a cluster of drones detonated along its spine. A Dravani frigate spun out of control as micro-singularities chewed through its bridge. On the dominance of will, alarms screamed. The main display was a mess of red ship after ship reporting critical damage, loss of power, hull breaches, total destruction. The numbers were changing so fast that the tactical computer could not keep up. "Commander," Kalvith shouted over the noise, "we have lost 37 ships in the first 3 minutes." Torvald gripped the edge of the command console. His scales had gone pale, a sign of deep shock in a Dravani. He had seen battles before. He had seen ships destroyed, but he had never seen anything like this. The human ship was not fighting his fleet. It was dismantling it. "All ships concentrate fire on the human vessel," he ordered. "Everything we have." The surviving ships turned and fired again. Plasma and particle beams converged on the Thermopylae from every direction. The adaptive armor shifted and flowed, absorbing and redirecting energy. Where the first barrage had caused the hull to glow, this second barrage barely left a mark. The ship had already learned. The Thermopylae continued its work without pause. The mass inversion cannon fired every 8 seconds, each shot collapsing another ship into nothing. The swarm drones spread across the battlefield like a cloud of death, slipping through every defense and detonating inside hulls and engines and reactors. 7 minutes into the engagement, Torvald received a damage report that made his blood run cold. 83 ships destroyed or disabled. Over 60% of his fleet gone in less time than it took to eat a meal, and the Thermopylae had sustained no meaningful damage. None. "Commander," the sensor officer said, and her voice was barely above a whisper, "the human ship has locked its main weapon onto the dominance of will." Torvald looked at the display. The violet glow at the center of the Thermopylae's forward hull was building again, brighter than before, aimed directly at his flagship. He could feel it in his bones, that terrible light. He could feel the weight of it. He had fought in wars. He had crushed rebellions. He had broken the spirit of entire worlds. But standing on his bridge, watching that light grow, Commander Torvald of the Dravani Imperium understood for the first time in his life what it felt like to be prey. "All ships," he said, and his voice cracked for the first time in 30 years of service. "Full retreat. All ships disengage and retreat to FTL jump points immediately." The fleet broke. There was no order to the retreat. Ships turned and ran in every direction, their engines burning at maximum, their crews desperate to reach the safe distance needed for an FTL jump. Some made it. Some did not. The swarm drones pursued the slowest ships and tore them apart from the inside. The Thermopylae did not chase them. As the surviving ships scattered and jumped away, blinking out of existence one by one as they entered FTL, the great human warship held its position. It recalled its drones. It powered down its forward cannon. The violet light faded. The weapons ports closed. The ship returned to its idle state, floating quietly in the dark between planets. The battle, if it could be called a battle, had lasted 11 minutes. When the last Dravani ship vanished from the system, Admiral Lydia Okonkwo stood on the bridge of the Thermopylae and looked at the field of wreckage that had once been a galactic compliance fleet. Twisted metal, frozen gas, the tiny, dense marbles that had once been warships. She felt no joy. She had not wanted this. None of them had. Humanity had built the Thermopylae hoping it would never need to fire. But hope was not a strategy, and the universe had just proved that. She opened a channel on the same frequency Torvan had used. She knew the retreating ships would hear it. She knew the message would be carried back to the Council. She chose her words carefully, because she understood that this moment would define humanity's place in the galaxy for centuries to come. This is Admiral Okonkwo of the United Earth Navy to the surviving vessels of the Galactic Council fleet. We did not seek this engagement. We asked you to leave. You chose to stay. Let there be no misunderstanding about what happened here today. She paused. Tell your council that humanity said no, and we meant it. The channel closed. The Thermopylae went dark, its running lights dimming until it was nothing more than a shadow against the stars. Behind it, the wreckage of 83 warships drifted slowly in the silence of space. A message written in metal and fire for anyone else who might come looking. The survivors arrived at Varith Prime in pieces. Not all at once, but in a slow, terrible trickle, ships limping out of FTL with burned hulls and shattered systems, crews traumatized into silence, officers who could barely speak when asked what had happened. Of the 200 warships that had entered the Sol system, 109 returned. Many of those were damaged beyond repair. Commander Torvan was among the last to arrive. His flagship, the Dominance of Will, had taken no direct hits, but its port engine array had been damaged by a swarm drone that had phased through the outer hull before it was intercepted by an emergency containment field. The ship listed slightly to one side as it docked, a small imperfection that, for a Dravani commander, was a mark of deep shame. Torvan did not speak to anyone when he stepped off the ship. He walked through the docking corridor with his eyes fixed ahead, his scales still pale, his jaw locked tight. Officers and crew lined the corridor to watch him pass. No one said a word. The emergency session of the Galactic Council was called within the hour. The great chamber was different this time. The living crystal ceiling had turned a deep, bruised red, a color it had not shown in over 1,000 years. It was the color of alarm, of danger, of something broken. Every seat was filled. Every delegate was present. Even species that normally sent only minor representatives had dispatched their highest officials. High Arbiter Zelkan stood at the center, and for the first time in his long career, he looked old. Commander Torvan, he said, report. Torvan stepped forward. He activated the tactical recording from the Dominance of Will and let it play on the chamber's holographic display. No one spoke as the footage unfolded. They watched the fleet open fire. They watched the human ship absorb every shot without flinching. They watched the violet beam collapse ships into marbles. They watched the swarm drones phase through solid matter and destroy vessels from the inside. They watched the retreat, the desperate, chaotic scramble of a broken fleet running for its life. 11 minutes, that was all it took. When the recording ended, the chamber was silent. Not the comfortable silence of a routine session or the polite silence of diplomacy. This was the silence of creatures who had just realized that the ground beneath them was not as solid as they had believed. One ship, Torvan said. His voice was flat and hollow. It was one ship. The Dravani ambassador, Dreth, was the first to recover. He rose from his seat, his scales flushed dark with anger. This is unacceptable. We must respond with overwhelming force. Assemble the full Imperium fleet, not a compliance force, a war fleet. 1,000 ships. 2,000. We will crush them. With respect, Ambassador, Torvan said, and there was no respect in his voice at all. I fired everything I had at that ship. 200 ships, coordinated barrage, full power. It did nothing. The ship learned from our weapons and adapted in real time. A larger fleet would simply give it more data. Dreth opened his mouth to argue, but Zelkon raised a hand. Before we discuss our response, we must understand what we are dealing with. I have asked the Intelligence Division to present a full analysis of the human species, not the summary we reviewed before, the complete file. A Velethi intelligence officer stepped forward. She was young, nervous, and clearly aware that the information she carried was going to make the room very uncomfortable. She activated her display and began. We have conducted a thorough analysis of humanity's history, technology, and military capability using data intercepted from their communication networks, recovered debris from the engagement, and information obtained from long-range observation probes placed in their system decades ago. She paused and took a steadying breath. First, regarding the vessel designated Thermopylae. Based on energy output analysis and structural scanning, we have classified it as a Titan-class dreadnought. It is 19.4 kilometers in length, constructed inside the shell of a hollowed-out asteroid. Its power source is, as Commander Torvan reported, a contained stellar fragment, a piece of a collapsing star held in magnetic confinement and used as a continuous energy source. She let that settle for a moment, then continued. The ship's hull is covered in what we are calling adaptive nanoarmor. It is composed of billions of microscopic machines that can rearrange themselves at the molecular level. When struck by a weapon, the armor analyzes the attack, determines the optimal defensive configuration, and restructures itself within seconds. Each subsequent attack of the same type becomes less effective. In theory, after sufficient exposure, the armor could become nearly immune to any known weapon. The chamber murmured. The Kothari delegate pulsed an agitated shade of orange. The primary weapon is a mass inversion cannon. It generates a localized field that reverses the gravitational constant inside a target, causing the target to collapse under its own weight. The secondary weapons include high-energy particle lances, antimatter torpedoes, and the phase-shift swarm drones that Commander Torvan encountered. She paused again. This time she looked directly at Zelkon. Now, the information the Council needs to hear. The Thermopylae is not humanity's most powerful warship. It is not even part of their primary fleet. The chamber stirred. Based on intercepted communications and orbital observation, the Thermopylae is classified by the human military as a border defense vessel. Its designation within their fleet structure is that of a deterrent, a ship designed to discourage hostile approach without requiring the deployment of their main force. Dreth's jaw fell open slightly. Kalvith, who had accompanied Torvan to the session, closed his eyes. The main fleet of the United Earth Navy is stationed behind their moon, the body they call Luna. Our long-range sensors have detected a minimum of 47 additional vessels of comparable size and energy output. 47 Titan-class dreadnoughts, each one a match for the Thermopylae. The chamber erupted. Delegates shouted over each other. Several smaller species representatives stood and began moving toward the exits. The crystal ceiling flared a violent crimson. Zelkon slammed his staff against the floor. The sound cut through the noise like a blade. Silence, let her finish. The intelligence officer swallowed hard and continued. There is more. We have analyzed humanity's historical records in detail. What we found is significant. She brought up a timeline on the display. It stretched back thousands of years, marked with dates and events and images. Humanity has been engaged in armed conflict with itself for its entire recorded history. They have fought wars over territory, over resources, over religion, over ideas. In their most recent global conflict, which occurred approximately 80 years before they achieved FTL travel, they killed over 70 million of their own kind in a span of 6 years. The number hung in the air, 70 million. Some of the delegates could not even imagine that number of individuals. Some species in the Council had total populations smaller than that. During this conflict, they developed a weapon that splits the atom itself, releasing enormous destructive energy. They used this weapon on 2 of their own cities. She showed the images: flattened landscapes, shadows burned into stone. After the war, they did not stop building these weapons. They built thousands of them. They pointed them at each other. And they lived like this, with the power to destroy their own world many times over for decades. The Illyrathi observer, who had been perfectly still throughout the presentation, made a soft clicking sound. It was the Illyrathi equivalent of grim satisfaction. Their FTL drive, the officer continued, was not developed through peaceful scientific research. It was derived from weapons technology. Specifically, it is a modified version of a relativistic acceleration system, originally designed to deliver planet-killing projectiles across interstellar distances. They turned a weapon of mass destruction into a method of transportation. She brought up one final piece of data. 3 standard months ago, we sent a diplomatic probe through the outer Sol system. It was a standard observation device, transmitting on encrypted Council frequencies. The humans intercepted it. They captured it. And in 3 weeks, they reverse-engineered our communication protocols, our encryption methods, and our language databases. That is how Admiral Okonkwo spoke to Commander Torvan in fluent galactic common. That is how she contacted him, on a classified Dravani military frequency. She turned off the display and stepped back. That concludes the analysis. The chamber was quiet again, but this was a different quiet than before. Before, it had been the silence of shock. Now it was the silence of understanding, slow, heavy understanding settling over the Council like a weight. Zelkan spoke first. We did not find a primitive species. No, the Illyrathi observer said from its corner. Its voice was as dry and calm as ever. You found a species that has been at war since before it could write. A species that turned the power of stars into fuel and the power of atoms into weapons. A species that has spent its entire existence preparing to fight something, and until now, the only enemy it could find was itself. It paused. I told you, High Arbiter, death worlds do not breed the timid. Dreth slammed his fist on his console. Then what do we do? If we cannot fight them and we cannot ignore them, what is left? Zelkan looked out across the chamber. He saw fear in the eyes of delegates who had never known fear. He saw confusion in minds that had always been certain. He saw the first cracks in an order that had stood for 10,000 years. We talked to them, he said quietly. Talk, Dreth repeated, as if the word was poison. Yes, Zelkan said, because the alternative is testing whether 47 more of those ships are as effective as the first one, and I do not believe any of us wish to learn that answer. Behind them, the crystal ceiling pulsed, red fatting slowly to a deep, uncertain violet, the color of something unknown, the color of a future that no one in the chamber could predict. Somewhere far away, behind the pale surface of a moon orbiting a small blue planet, 47 dark shapes floated in silence. Their lights were off. Their weapons were cold. They waited in the shadow, patient and still, like wolves resting between hunts. Humanity had not come looking for war, but if war came looking for humanity, it would find them ready. It would always find them ready. That was the part that frightened the Council most of all. 6 months passed. 6 months of tense silence between the Galactic Council and the Sol system. No ships crossed the border. No weapons were fired. But the silence was not peace. It was 2 sides watching each other across a line that neither wanted to cross first. During those 6 months, the galaxy changed in small but important ways. 3 minor species quietly opened secret communication channels with Earth. The Kothari Collective began pulling its trade ships away from Dravani military routes. 2 council members formally requested that their compliance agreements be reviewed. The old order was not crumbling, but it was creaking like a building that had stood too long and was beginning to feel the weight of its own age. High Arbiter Zelkan spent most of those months in private meetings, arguing, negotiating, and sometimes simply sitting alone in his chambers, staring at the holographic image of a blue and green planet that refused to do what it was told. The decision to send a diplomatic envoy was not popular. Ambassador Dreth called it surrender. The Dravani Imperium threatened to withdraw from the Council entirely. 14 species voted against it. But Zelkan pushed it through, because Zelkan understood something that Dreth did not. You do not negotiate from strength when the other side has already proven it can destroy you. You negotiate because destroying each other helps no one. The meeting point was a newly constructed station called Halfway Point. It was built in deep interstellar space, exactly between Council territory and the Sol system. Both sides contributed materials. Both sides had engineers on site. The construction took 3 months, and it was the first thing that humans and aliens had built together. It was small and plain, a pressurized cylinder with a conference room, a few observation windows, and basic life support. Nothing fancy. It did not need to be. The Council's diplomatic delegation arrived first. Zelkan led it personally. He brought a small team of advisors, a translator, though he suspected the humans would not need one, and 2 guards who carried ceremonial weapons that everyone knew were useless. Ambassador Dreth had refused to come. The Illyrathi observer, however, had insisted. They waited in the conference room. It was quiet except for the soft hum of the air systems. Through the observation window, the stars were cold and distant. Zelkan folded his 4-fingered hands on the table and tried to keep his breathing steady. The human shuttle docked 30 minutes later. It was small, unarmed. It carried no military escort, no fighter screen, no support vessels. A single shuttle, arriving alone in the emptiness of space. The airlock opened. Footsteps echoed in the corridor, and then Admiral Lydia Okonkwo walked into the room. She was smaller than Zelkan had expected. Humans were not large creatures, the data had told him that, but seeing one in person was different. She stood barely taller than his chest. Her skin was dark brown, her hair cut short and streaked with gray at the temples. She wore a dress uniform, deep navy blue with gold buttons and a row of small colored ribbons above her left breast. She carried no weapons. She wore no armor. She walked in alone. That was the part that unsettled the Council delegation most. They had sent guards and advisors and the full weight of diplomatic protocol. Humanity had sent one woman in a clean uniform. Okonkwo surveyed the room with steady eyes. She looked at each Council member in turn, not with hostility, not with arrogance, but with the calm attention of someone who was very good at reading a room. Then she sat down, placed her hands flat on the table, and spoke. "Thank you for agreeing to meet. I know this was not easy for your Council. I want to begin by saying that humanity did not want the engagement that took place in our system. We asked your fleet to leave. They chose not to. What followed was a consequence of that choice, not our desire." Her voice was the same as it had been over the communications channel, calm, clear, and certain. But in person, there was a warmth to it that had not come through before. She meant what she was saying. Zelkan could hear that. "What does humanity want?" Zelkan asked. He saw no point in diplomatic games. The time for those had passed. Okonkwo nodded, as if she appreciated the directness. 3 things. First, full recognition of human sovereignty over our system and any systems we settle in the future. We will not be governed by a body we did not choose. Zelkan inclined his head. Reasonable, continue. Second, a seat on the Galactic Council. Not as observers, not as a junior member. A full seat with full voting rights. If you are going to make decisions that affect the galaxy, we intend to be part of that process. This caused a stir among the advisors. A species that had achieved FTL travel only recently demanding a full council seat was unusual. But then again, nothing about this situation was usual. And third, Okonkwo said, and her voice became quieter but harder, like steel wrapped in cloth. The immediate end of the compliance program. The room went still. Not just for humanity, she continued. For every species, every world that has been brought under compliance, forced to surrender its resources and its freedom, that ends. Today, no new compliance operations, no subjugation fleets. Every species in this galaxy has the right to choose its own path. That is not negotiable. One of Zelkon's advisors leaned forward. Admiral, the compliance system has maintained galactic stability for thousands of years. You cannot simply dismantle it. I can ask, Okonkwo said, and I am asking, because the next species you send a compliance fleet to might not be as patient as we were. The galaxy is full of Death World's arbiter. We are not the only thing out here that learned to bite. Zelkon studied her for a long moment. He was old. He had negotiated with hundreds of species over his career. He had faced threats, manipulations, bluffs, and lies. He knew the difference between someone who was posturing and someone who meant every word. Admiral Okonkwo meant every word. You destroyed 83 of our ships. Zelkon said, and now you sit here, unarmed and alone, asking for peace and freedom for species you have never met. I confess, Admiral, I do not fully understand your people. Okonkwo looked at him, and for the first time something that might have been a sad smile crossed her face. We have spent our entire history hurting each other, Arbiter. Every generation, every century. We have burned our own cities and poisoned our own land. We know what war costs better than any species in this galaxy because we have paid that price over and over again. She paused. We built the Thermopylae because we had to, but we came here in a shuttle because we wanted to. That is the difference. The room was quiet. The Illyrathi observer sat perfectly still, its black eyes fixed on the human admiral. It had not spoken since the meeting began. Zelkon turned to the observer. You have been unusually silent. The Illyrathi tilted its long head. I have been listening, that is what I do. It looked at Okonkwo. Admiral, I voted to abstain when your compliance was ordered. I wish I had voted against it. That was a failure of courage on my part. Okonkwo met the creature's gaze. You warned them, that counts for something. Not enough, the Illyrathi said, but perhaps this will. It turned to Zelkon. I formally propose the admission of humanity to the Galactic Council as a full member, with full voting rights. I further propose a review of all active compliance agreements, with the goal of granting sovereignty to any species that requests it. The room erupted into argument. Advisors shouted. Delegates protested. The crystal communicators crackled with transmissions from council members watching remotely. Some were furious. Some were afraid. A few, mostly the smaller species, the ones who remembered what it felt like to be powerless, were quietly, fiercely hopeful. The vote was called. It was not unanimous. It was not even comfortable, but it passed. 30 of the 43 member species voted in favor. Humanity would join the council. When it was over, Zelkon and Okonkwo stood together by the observation window. The stars stretched out before them, vast, cold, and indifferent. I must ask you something, Zelkon said, not as a diplomat, as one person to another. Okonkwo waited. What kind of species builds a weapon capable of killing gods and then walks into a room alone and unarmed to ask for peace? Okonkwo looked out at the stars. She was quiet for a moment. The kind that knows what happens when you don't try for peace, she said. We have buried too many of our own to think that strength alone is enough. The ships, the weapons, the armor, those keep us alive, but they don't make us who we are. She turned to face him. We are who we are because every time we burned something down, we chose to build it back up, every single time. Zelkon studied her face. In his long life, he had met conquerors and cowards, tyrants and saints. He had never met a species quite like this, a species forged in fire that still reached out its hand instead of making a fist. You frighten me, Admiral, he said honestly. Good, she said. Frightened people pay attention. She shook his hand, a human gesture he had read about but never experienced. Her grip was warm and firm. Then she turned and walked back to her shuttle, her boots echoing in the empty corridor. The Illyrathi observer appeared beside Zelkon as the airlock sealed. They watched the human shuttle detach and drift away into the dark, a tiny point of light against the endless black. "What kind of species?" Zelkon repeated softly, almost to himself. The Illyrathi clicked gently. "The kind that has already learned what war costs. That is what makes them the most dangerous species in this galaxy, Arbiter. They choose peace, but they never forgot how to fight, and they never will." Zelkon said nothing. He watched the shuttle grow smaller and smaller until it was gone. Behind him, the station hummed quietly. Ahead of him, the galaxy waited, vast and uncertain and full of things that were about to change. The old order was ending. Something new was beginning. And at the heart of it was a small, stubborn, impossible species from a death world that had looked at the stars and decided to reach for them with one hand open and one hand ready. Far away in the shadow of a pale moon, 47 dreadnoughts floated in the dark. Their lights were still off. Their weapons were still cold. They had not moved in 6 months, and if things went well, they would not move for a long time. But they were there. They would always be there, sleeping in the silence, waiting in the shadow, a promise and a warning written in metal and starlight. Humanity had said no, and the galaxy had listened.